Good morning. My name is Ken Reitler. I am the Distinguished Professor of Aerospace Engineering for the Robert A. Heinlein Trustee here at the U.S. Naval Academy. I'm also a member of the great class of 1973, who's celebrating our 40th reunion this weekend. The fact that my note paper is on green engineering paper instead of white note cards is probably a giveaway that I'm not a history professor, but I'm an engineering professor. But I am a student of history. So it's really my honor to kick off this first panel of the three that we're going to have discussing human spaceflight here at the 2013 Naval History Conference. But before I do, I want to thank General Stafford for giving us really kind of a great kickoff. He really sort of very quickly encapsulated the history for us of what it took to get into space, what the start of our human spaceflight experience really was. He also reminded me of a couple of events which, as a midshipman here at the Naval Academy, were, to me, defining moments. The first was, as a plebe, 3 weeks into plebe summer, we landed on the moon. That was truly something that got my path started in the right direction. And that followed off the next year with Captain Jim Lovell, who came and was our Forrestal lecturer and talked about his experience on Apollo 13. The combination of those two things really, to me, kind of set the stage for the 4 years that I was here at the Academy and led me on the path that took me here today. For a lot of those same reasons, I was really thrilled when the Institute selected human spaceflight as this year's theme. Having spent the majority of my career, 25 years, working in human spaceflight as an astronaut and an aerospace executive. And then last year, in the springtime, I introduced a brand new course to the curriculum here at the Naval Academy on human spaceflight. I'm going to teach that again next spring. So this is a great opportunity for me to recruit students and also to go hunt for guest lecturers. And we've got plenty of guest lecturers right here in the audience today. The topic for our first panel today is Mercury to Shuttle, Guts and Ingenuity. How did we go from those very first tenuous steps into human spaceflight to going to the point where we were flying the most sophisticated spacecraft the world has ever seen? I'd like to invite our moderator, Mr. David Hartman, and our panelists to come and join us on the stage right now. And while they're doing that, I'm going to remind you that we will be having a question and answer session at the end, and please use the microphones. They're up there at the upper level. If you can't make it to a microphone, stand at your seat, and please ask your question very clearly and loudly. This is a very big room, so we'd like to hear your question. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Mr. David Hartman, for this morning's session, who will in turn introduce the panelists. For more than 35 years, David Hartman has produced, written, and hosted scores of award-winning documentaries for networks, public television, and cable TV. He's created numerous programs about aviation and space for a wide variety of organizations and has earned him many distinguished awards. As the original host of Good Morning America for over 12 years, he conducted more than 12,000 interviews with subjects ranging from world leaders to families in the American heartland. In 2010 and 2011, as a panel moderator, a job that he does so well, he accompanied Jim Lovell, Jim Cernan, and the late Neil Armstrong as they went on morale-boosting tours visiting our troops in Southwest Asia and Northern Arabian Sea. Mr. Hartman is also a nationally and internationally published photojournalist. He really is good behind the camera as well as in front of the camera. He holds a BA in economics and served 3 years active duty as an officer in the United States Air Force, Strategic Air Command. But he does have significant Navy connections. His son is a naval aviator, an F-18 Hornet pilot who's just finished 10 years of distinguished service. Now, I've worked with David on a number of other occasions, and I can say without any hesitation that we are indeed honored to have you with us today to be our moderator. David?
Thanks, Ken. Good morning, everybody. You know, I would like to just briefly add a little epilogue on General Stafford's remarkable presentation. His encyclopedic kind of memory of detail of everything that happened during those decades is just remarkable. But what he was describing and what we're going to be talking about, I think most would agree that from President Kennedy's speech in May of 1961 until Apollo 11 landed on the moon and the programs that followed, that this was, I think most will agree, the greatest scientific and human challenge and achievement in the history of our country, a challenge to our creativity, our imagination, our commitment, our discipline, and our perseverance. And it was accomplished not by just a few, as in astronauts and a few engineers, but by literally hundreds of thousands of dedicated Americans. They were brilliant engineers, technicians, managers, scientists, academics, and of course, aviator astronauts. It was probably the last time in our history, here in our country, where everybody in our country pulled together to accomplish something that was truly remarkable. So we're applauding not only our astronauts and our engineers, but all of those people who made those programs work. Our four panelists today personally reflect all of that history. All of our panelists are aeronautical engineers. 3 are naval aviators, 1 a marine aviator. They are all test pilots. They're all astronauts, of course. And between them, they have earned every aviation and space honor and award. To read their CVs, we would be here all day. And so I'm going to be very brief so that we can hear more from them. Jim Lovell, enshrined in the National Aviation Hall of Fame. He was a director of the F-4H Phantom test program as a test pilot. He was the first astronaut to fly 4 times in space, twice in Gemini, twice in Apollo. He would have been the 5th man to walk on the moon, but as we all know, he and his crew had to tell Houston, we have a problem. Retired Navy Captain Jim Lovell. Bob Crippen, first astronaut selection was the Manned Orbiting Lab program before he moved over to Shuttle, where he piloted STS1 with John Young. He commanded 3 more shuttle flights, then went on to extensive management experience, and including as director of the KSC and in the private sector. Retired Navy Captain Bob Crippen. Bob Cabana has 4 shuttle flights to his credit, including the first flight to begin the assembly of ISS. Also has extensive management experience, both in active duty and in the private sector. He is currently director of the Kennedy Space Center. Retired Marine Colonel Bob Cabana. And Ken Ham, before his astronaut life, he had many years in the FA-18 Hornet community, both fleet and test, and with 2 shuttle flights to his credit. Ken is now chairman of the Aerospace Engineering Department here at the Academy. Navy Captain, not retired, Ken Ham. This works? Yeah, it does. Jim, start us off. Morning, guys. Jim, start us off. When Tom talked about Mercury, thought of you, of course, because you were in that first group. You weren't one of the first 7, of course, but you were in that first group. We have heard a lot of stories about what those first medical tests were of you guys. Tell us about that. Crippen's already smiling, too.
Well, let me start off by
hey,
saying
pull that mic a little closer, Jim. Pull your microphone a little bit closer.
Can you hear me now? Everybody hear me? Let me start out by saying just exactly how this whole thing got started. Of course, at Langley, the Space Task Group, and with the old NACA became NSAA, decided that they thought they could put somebody into orbit, put man into orbit, but they didn't know whether man would live in zero gravity, how long it would be, how to get there. And so they started with this idea of what became Mercury. They decided who should go. I mean, what type of a person should be an astronaut? And there was a lot of contemplation on here, a lot of decisions. So how about a double amputee? Because they don't need the legs. In this little capsule, just the arms. Now, that didn't sound too good. And then what about stuntmen? Because they're used to this sort of environment. Let's see about that. And that wasn't too good either. It was President Eisenhower that actually came down and said, look, if we're going to put people in there, we ought to have people, first of all, that had security clearances because some of the information or some of the projects were classified, but also that the test pilot types, because they were interested and had been cued in testing airplanes, and they, after all, spacecraft are going to be airplanes, because in this initial approach to space, this was R&D, research and development. Not so much that we were going to learn a lot about, once we were up there, about the Earth or about the stars or something like that. And so test pilots were selected. NASA approached the Air Force and the Navy to give people who had the following criteria. One was they had to have an engineering degree. They had to have 1,000 hours in jet flying. Now, I'm not too sure why that was a criterion, but that's what they thought at the time. They couldn't be over the age of 35. They couldn't be over 6 feet tall because of the structure of the Atlas, which they're now looking at. And that was about it, I think. And so out of that, about 110 people came out of their computers that sort of met their idea. And then they had a selection then of about 40 each going to Washington. It was still secret. It got secret orders. I was at Patuxent River at the time. And of course, then I saw Wally Schirra drive out going to Washington. Then I saw Al Shepard drive out, and I followed them all. And we had a briefing, what this was all about, that they were going to build a capsule on top of an Atlas booster. And at this time, Atlases were blowing up every other day down at the Cape, and put a person into orbit. Very interesting. Then out of that 110, eventually, 32 were selected. I was one of the selectees of this regional group, and we went to the Loveless Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And they were known for aerospace medical. And we went through the test, and Dave was absolutely right. These people were not so much interested whether we were physically fit to go into space. They knew that here was a set of guinea pigs that were going to do something that had, in an environment that had never been done before. And they were getting information totally obscure from how well we were. I mean, they were putting probes in our hands and putting electrical probes in, and when they turned on the juice, our arms would crank up, then they'd look at an oscilloscope to find out how that was going. We had our feet in cold water to see how long we could take it. We got into partial pressure suits and see how long that would work, and all kinds of things of this nature. And they took liquids from every orifice that we had, and it finally came about it. But anyway, to make a long story short, out of that 32, of course, the original 7 were selected. And of course, I came back very highly dejected. I was sort of interested in rockets because in my first class year at the Academy, 1951, I wrote my term paper on the development of the liquid fuel rocket engine. And so I was sort of wanted to go in that direction, but it wasn't until the second time around that I got a chance.
Jim, when we heard General Stafford talk about the Mercury program, but let's go to Gemini and your first Gemini mission, which was 7, and that rendezvous mission. What were the big challenges? How optimistic were you were going to be able to pull this off?
Well, Tom covered it somewhat, but it was a very, very interesting flight, and also sort of a good mark towards eventual going to Apollo. First of all, can man live for 2 weeks in space? Some of the doctors thought that was not possible. And so Frank and I were designated to try to see if we could do that, because people said in zero gravity, or the doctors did, didn't we evolve under gravity here on the Earth? Are there some body functions that needed gravity to keep us going? And it turned out, of course, it didn't. That gravity was not lack of gravity was not a factor. But the 2 weeks were a long period of time, and I have to tell you, quite frankly, 2 weeks with Frank Borman any place was a hard time. People often ask, well, how did you live in 2 weeks in that capsule? We took a look at it, how small it is. And as a matter of fact, when I was testing it at the factory, I was back in the capsule for about 10 hours, and I thought to myself, I'm not going to make this. I mean, 2 weeks of this thing? Well, it turns out that zero gravity was the savior, because you weren't sitting in your seat. You didn't get pressure points on your bottom. You just floated with the little strap across it. And it was so small that you could not straighten out your legs. You had to bend your torso. Or if you wanted to straighten out your torso, you had to bend your legs. And that's how small it was. But we managed to live that. And the second thing, of course, that was so important was the rendezvous, the initial rendezvous, where we could get up close together within about 2 feet of each other and float around and actually fly around, take pictures, and see what the situation was. Kind of an interesting incident, however, on that, because for 2 weeks, Frank and I were on this spacecraft going around, and occasionally, every once in a while, on the nose of Gemini, we could see shadows. And then the shadows would disappear. And then they would come again, shadows. And we thought, my gosh, what is this? Maybe there is something to this UFOs and aliens and things like that. Well, it turned out when Gemini 6 came up and they looked around us, what we saw were the straps where the explosive device had been around separating the booster from the spacecraft, and these straps were still attached to the spacecraft, and every once in a while as we maneuvered a little bit, these straps would get up behind and the sun would throw a shadow on the nose of the spacecraft.
Each mission, of course, built on the successes and lessons learned from the previous missions. Tom mentioned Gemini 12, you and Buzz. How much was learned from Ed White's experience? How much was learned from Gene Cernan's experience with those EVAs to make 12 as successful as it was?
Well, one of the things that we had to learn about how can we work outside of the spacecraft. And Ed White, when he first went out, had a little thruster, a little V-shaped or a square-shaped thrusters with two little thrusters to maneuver around. Actually, it did not work hardly at all. But he just floated out there and was thrilled with the new environment that he had. We had a hard time bringing him back in. But he didn't really have to work at anything. We didn't have him really doing things. And so we finally got Ed back into the spacecraft. Jim McDivitt was the commander of that one. Then we were decided to do how can we actually work. And of course, with Gemini 9 and Gene Cernan, we're going to do all sorts of things, including trying this AMU, this float, this backpack to fly around in. Well, what we all forgot about was Newton's third law of motion. To every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. When you neutralize the Earth's gravity and you're floating around, the spacecraft itself became a pretty big mass. And consequently, whenever you would get to touch the spacecraft, it would tend to repel you. And you had to learn how to use zero gravity to your advantage rather than to your disadvantage. And consequently, Gene was, very optimistic at first and very aggressive, and he tried to do things, and of course, he heated up. His heart rate got very high. We finally got him back. And then on 10 and 11, we also had the same problems. And therefore, as Tom mentioned, I think it was an engineer that came up with the idea using underwater to test for zero gravity. And what we did was we rented a swimming pool in a boys' school in Baltimore, took a mock-up of the Gemini, the back end of the Gemini, the Ohms area, and then we brought Buzz up, got him suited up in a space suit, which works just as well underwater as it does in space. But we put weights around his waist to make him neutrally buoyant. And then we said, Buzz, don't try to swim. We want you to go down there and test these hand holes and these toe holes and things like that and do some work underwater. And this actually was the breakthrough that allowed us to work outside the spacecraft. He did quite well, and when we actually did the flight, he did about 3 EVAs, about 5.5 hours, something like that, of extravehicular activity. And now, of course, you see the Russians and we all have these large swimming pools to do the work that later on these gentlemen all did outside.
Tom also, of course, talked about the space race and competition with the Soviets at the time. Your Apollo 8 mission, the mission was changed last minute, as it were. How much of those changes to Apollo 8 were technical reasons to change the mission, and how much was geopolitical?
Most of the changes were political, I should say, geopolitical. 2 things occurred in the summer of 1968 that changed our mission completely. First of all, we were supposed to be another Earth orbital flight, but we were going to change our orbit to go up about 24,000 miles or something like that, or very high anyway, maybe 5,000 miles, and come back in at a near lunar return velocity to check out the spacecraft coming back from the moon. That was the original mission. 2 things happened, though, in '68. The first thing happened was that Grumman Aircraft, building the lunar module, working hard to get, because we were going to have the lunar module with us, said there's no way we can get a lunar module ready by 1968. And so we sort of looked at that, and they said the earliest it could be is 1969. And then second thing happened, we had intelligence information that the Russians were going to put a man around the moon, or men, around the moon in the late fall of 1968. As a matter of fact, Tom mentioned this briefly, but they had the Proton, this large booster that they now had, and they also had a spacecraft which they called Zond, Z-O-N-D, and they planned to put the man around the moon, not to orbit, just to circumnavigate the moon and come back again, because they knew our schedule. They knew what we were planning to do in '69. And consequently, they sent the Proton and Zond 5 up, I think, sometime in the summer of 1968. Very successful, went around the moon, came back, landed in the Pacific, but the reentry was too steep. They hadn't developed the reentry too much, and they had small animals in the vehicle, and all the animals died in the high deceleration. But they were very concerned people. I mean, you know, they were really going at it, so they brought out another Proton, Zond 6, more animals, sent it around the moon too, and it was somewhat successful coming back in, landing. But then there was this idea of, well, should we send the people around now with Zond 7? And Leonov was one of them that was going to go. Or should we send another animal flight around? Meanwhile, in this country, and a good example of leadership, looked at the fact about going to the moon, and they said, the lunar module is not ready. Why don't we send Apollo 8 to the moon if Apollo 7 is successful in their 11-day orbital flight? If everything works on 11 with the command module, we'll send Apollo 8 to the moon. And consequently, then we heard about it sometime, I think August, September, started working on a lunar flight, which meant the navigation, in the technical sense, was entirely different. I went up to MIT where they're developing the navigation system for the Apollo for our lunar flight and to work that way. And of course, I think of all the flights of Apollo, really 8 was perhaps the most technical free and successful flight.
You were the first humans to see the back of the moon. What was that like?
Yeah, we were very lucky. We were the first 3 humans to see the far side of the moon, which of course we don't see here on Earth. We could see the the structure of the lunar surface back there, which is more mottled and more small crater-like than on the near side of the moon. We could also see the Earth arise, and you also saw the picture, and Tom showed it here. That is really, perhaps, to me, the highlight of that particular flight, because it gave you an impression, it gave you an idea of really how small we really all are. You look back at the Earth some 240,000 miles away, and in reality, you know, we're still fairly close. But you don't see, you know, you see continents, you see clouds, you see the water. You don't see people, of course. You don't see anything. It appears that, you know, the Earth is completely uninhabited. But you know, just down there, there are some 5 or 6 billion astronauts all striving for life on this spacecraft we call Earth. And so it's something to which we thought we could all bring back to the people of the world. And I think the picture itself is perhaps the best purveyor of what we saw.
What was it like getting out of that moon orbit to redirect yourself back to Earth? How complicated was that?
Well, of course, the cue in the very first flight, being the very flash to the moon, was, you know, how about getting out of Earth orbit, or out of moon orbit, lunar orbit? Because, you know, once we were captured and slowed down and got to be a satellite of the moon, the thoughts were in the back of our minds, will that engine start on the second time around? And consequently, all the functions of doing that had to be on the far side of the moon, away from the communication with the Earth. So we had a program going, and on the last time we went around to the near side to talk to the Earth, they gave us up the final parameters to put in the computer. I was the navigator, and I was operating the computer. And as we came around the far side, as the computer and the time started to count down to actually light the engine at the proper time, the computer had two things on it. Well, it had a indication on it. It said, at 5 seconds to go, it said, "Do you really want to make this maneuver?" And I'm sitting there, you know, about ready to punch the button, and Borman says, "Push the button, push the button." So we did. Of course, the engine lit and stayed on for about 3 minutes, getting us faster and faster as we got around the far side. And as we came around finally to the near side, I finally called the control center in Houston and said, "Houston, please be informed, there is a Santa Claus." So.
Jump to 13. Some people have said because you didn't make it to the moon that the mission was a failure, that you weren't the fifth guy to walk on the moon. Describe 13 and its successes.
Well, I kind of thought I was a failure too when I came back. We had only one good experiment on that flight, and that was mainly done by Mission Control that took the spent booster that was following us to the moon, changed its course slightly. It impacted the moon, and the seismometer left by Apollo 12 picked up the results of the impactment, and we learned a lot about the surface of the lunar surface. But after years, I was thinking that even though, you know, it was sort of a failure, and you have to remember that NASA sort of lives on success. That's where our appropriations come from, the success. And consequently, right after the flight, after the initial euphoria of coming back, the spacecraft, after the manufacturers looked at it, was exiled to Paris. It was in the small museum in Paris for many years. And not much was said about it. There was no large amount of telegrams that came back. Usually after these flights, you know, the guys would get telegrams from friends and things like that. You know, there were no Collier medals, you know, no things like that at all. It was sort of a failure. And then after a while, we started to think about this thing, that it was a failure in its initial program, the initial thing it was supposed to do. But it was really a success in the ability of a group of men in the control center working with a flight crew to take a system, an almost certain catastrophe, and bring it back as a successful recovery. What they had to do to overcome, what they had to think about, what they had to look at, what was in the spacecraft for us to work with to overcome things like being poisoned by our own breath. Carbon dioxide was building up. There weren't enough canisters to remove the carbon dioxide for 3 people. We were on the wrong course to begin with. We didn't have enough power to keep the guidance system going. We had to turn it down, and we had to figure out and use a procedure that we had developed for Apollo 8, but we thought was so way out that we'd never have to use it. And it turned out that we did have to use it on the way back to get back into the entry corridor to make a safe landing.
Rip, your first assignment as an astronaut to the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, but we don't hear a lot about that. Why not? What was it?
Because if we told you, we'd have to shoot you, David. The Manned Orbiting Laboratory was started by the Department of Defense shortly after they canceled a program called Dinosaur. And it was supposed to be DOD, but the DOD part was all Air Force and 2 Navy guys and a Marine, but they were on it. It was supposed to do classified military objectives. I was assigned to it in 1967. I was 28 years old at the time. And we were going to fly out of Vandenberg so that we could do a polar orbit flying south to north. We ended up with about 14 crew members, astronauts, and I got a call one morning as I was getting ready to go to work on June the 10th of 1969 from my secretary. Says, "Crip, the program's canceled," which showed to me that life has got a lot of twists and turns, and you never can tell which way they're going to lead, because that was one of the low points in my life. But shortly thereafter, somebody thought, well, maybe NASA could use some of us guys. And so we went and interviewed, and Deke said, "I don't need anybody. You know, we're already starting to cancel lunar flights." And we probably knew that was the answer, but a gentleman by the name of George Miller, who was the AA for the Office of Spaceflight, told Deke, well, you got to take some of them. Now, why George made that decision, I'm not sure, but Deke said, okay, I'll take everybody that's 35 and younger. And that cut the group right in half. So we had 7 of us get transferred to the astronaut office. We did not go through another selection process, another physical. We just walked in the office and started working.
What were the what were the effects of the cancellation of that program?
Well, for me personally, it was pretty low.
Right, but I'm thinking about national policy.
There were concerns, I think, both from the standpoint of doing men and military work in space. There were some political concerns about that, and there was some technology that came along that would allow us to do a lot of that work without the crew on board. So that was the reason.
Until Space Shuttle 1, STS1, that's a bunch of years. What was your training process, and what did you do all those years, and how frustrating was it?
Well, actually, it was very rewarding. Because Deke says, you know, I'm going to hire some of you, but I don't have any flights for you until maybe this thing they're called the Space Shuttle, and that's lucky if it'll be in 1980. But I got lots of work for you to do. It turned out that MOL was using a lot of the systems that they were going to fly on Skylab. So myself and several of the other guys went to work immediately on Skylab and supported that throughout its preparation for flight, and then for the actual missions themselves as a Capcom. Followed that by the shuttle got approved in '72, and so I went to work working on shuttle design, crew requirements, and took a brief sabbatical. And when Tom asked me and a couple of the other guys to go support him on Apollo-Soyuz, and then I went back to, after that mission, to doing, again, shuttle work. It wasn't any training in that particular phase. I mean, we were doing engineering design work and requirements, and then I got surprised when I was told that I was going to get to fly the first one.
Well, that brings us to STS1. How challenging was it? One of those first flight situations. What were your greatest concerns, challenges?
Well, let me preface it by saying, you know, John Young was the chief of the astronaut office at that time. The office had dwindled down to about 20 people, so we didn't have a lot of astronauts around. And so I thought, well, you know, I'll get one of the early shuttle flights, but I didn't anticipate getting the first one because we did have several people that had flown previously, and I figured, well, the first mission will probably be John and one of the others. And then I got surprised, and somebody made the decision they wanted to expand our knowledge base as quickly as possible, so they were going to tie an experienced guy with a rookie on each flight. And if you're a rookie, John Young had flown 4 times at that point. Besides being chief of the astronaut office, he was our most experienced astronaut. And so when you're a rookie, you'd like to go with somebody that knows what they're doing. So I was lucky to be flying with John. We're both test pilots, and we were going to get to fly a test mission. It was a dream mission as far as both of us were concerned. You know, we had concerns, but both John and I thought we could get the vehicle down safely.
So what were the concerns? What were you most concerned about with that first
flight?
Well,
in the development, we were supposed to initially fly like late '79, and the main engines that power the shuttle kept blowing up on the test stands, and that wasn't very appealing. We also had these thermal protection system we referred as tiles, which were glued onto the structure, and the glue didn't stick, so they kept falling off. That didn't sound very good. And but NASA did the right thing and tackled those problems to go make sure they would work. And
what about when you flew? What happened when you were actually up in the air in space? Did stuff happen that got your attention and concerned you?
Well, when we got on orbit and I opened up our large payload bay doors, which are necessary to cool the spacecraft, I looked back on the rear on what we call our orbital maneuvering system pods, and we had about 15 or 20 tiles missing. And I knew that position was not required for re-entry. They were mainly there to at least minimize any damage for rework if we're going flying again. The question was, how about on the bottom of the vehicle? I think I felt very confident in it because I was aware that we had pulled on all of the critical tiles that were on the base of the spacecraft, and we had not pulled those ones on the OMS pods. So I was fairly confident, and John was as well, that it would be just fine. Plus, we couldn't do anything about it either.
Now you flew 41C and 41G. How fast and how much had technology changed and become more advanced between STS1 and your later mission?
Yeah. Not all that much. For my second mission, we had put in a heads-up display, which was nice to have, a HUD. We had improved some of the computer software, but most of the hardware was pretty much the same for all those missions.
Bob, to your 4 missions, how significant were each of those and why?
Well, let's see. The first one, we put Ulysses into polar orbit around the sun. It was a joint ESA and NASA mission, and it studied our sun with 11 experiments on board. it was only supposed to last for one trip around the sun. Basically, it had an IUS upper stage that took it out to Jupiter. It went over the north pole of Jupiter, and then Jupiter's gravity flung it into a polar orbit around the sun in a 5-year orbit, and it managed to see the sun at both a solar minimum and solar maximum. So that was pretty cool. My second one was a classified DoD mission. We deployed DoD-1, and I still can't talk about that. The third flight was a space lab mission, and we did science 24 hours a day for 16 days. We set the record for the longest shuttle mission, but it got broken after that. But that was kind of set the stage for how we do science on the International Space Station, the communications and how we work together. So an international flight. And then the last one was really special. I got to command Endeavour and put the first two pieces of the space station together. And when we were building the space station, it was back, well, I was chief of the astronaut office, and Bob talks about, you know, what do you do, new programs and not being able to fly and stuff. And the shuttle program was at its peak back then in the mid-90s. We were flying, at one point we flew 10 flights within a 12-month period. And all the astronauts, none of them really wanted to go work space station. They wanted to be involved with you know, the shuttle because they get to fly more frequently. And so finding the folks to go do that. But one of the things that we learned was initially the space station was supposed to be ship and shoot and just ship the module to the Cape, put it in a shuttle, and launch it to orbit. And we convinced them that we really need to do more testing. And that first flight, we spent hours out at Sonny Carter at the Boeing facility and NASA facility there testing the software. And then we got it down to the Cape, and we wanted to do more realistic testing. We had an emulator for the Russian module, and we were testing on the US module, Unity. And we convinced them that we needed to do mission essential integration tests down there. And we spent many hours down at the Cape testing and still finding issues that we fixed. And when we got on orbit and we actually sent the commands from the aft flight deck to power up the computers on the space station, I don't think anybody was more surprised than me when it actually worked. And everything worked perfect. And to be able to go inside, you know, for the first time and turn on the lights, and it was special. And you know, we had my Russian crewmate was Sergei Krikalev, and very experienced, the most experienced Russian cosmonaut. He was going to be on the first crew that actually lived on the space station with Bill Shepard and Yuri Gudzinko. And so it was just great flying with him, so pretty cool.
From an engineering point of view, to coordinate with, I mean, I'm thinking back now to Soyuz as well, but as advanced as these programs became, and thanks to a lot of your work, how complicated was it to match systems with the Russians? Not only the language problems, but to match up the engineering.
Well, and it's
so
not
that
just...
you'd know everything would...
Sure. And it's not just the Russian systems. I mean, and I'm sure they're going to talk about it in the ISS panel this afternoon, but you had hardware that was being built around the world, coming together for the very first time in space, and everything fit and worked perfectly. And it gets down to defining your requirements extremely well and then meeting your requirements. And it really is. I think when you look at the engineering achievements and challenges, it's probably the most... It's the most phenomenal engineering achievement that we've done. Putting the International Space Station up there is phenomenal. You know, and back to technology, you know, Kripp was talking about changes to the shuttle. When the shuttle started out, we were talking earlier, you know, the computers on the shuttle, it was the AP101B built by IBM up in Owego, New York. It had 104K of memory, 5 general purpose computers, and we actually loaded for different phases of the mission from tape drives. And we'd actually fly the tapes down to the Cape for the missions. And eventually, you know, using the internet, you sent the software down there electronically to make the tapes. And then eventually we went to a digital mass memory unit. And then in the mid-90s, we upgraded our computers from 104K to 256K of memory. So that was pretty impressive. But we actually set up our own computer network on board using IBM laptops. And we had a local area network, and we ran software on them. Like for Rendezvous, you know, what they learned during Gemini and Apollo, I mean, today, Rendezvous, it's so much simpler. And, you know, we actually ran a computer program rendezvous proximity operations program on the computer. It showed everything that was going on. It was tied into the orbiter's data. You could have a prediction of where you were going to be. It made rendezvous a lot simpler.
I understand that when you were a midshipman, that you visited the Cape for a launch.
Yeah.
What launch was
well,
that?
I figure I kind of, it's good I'm in the middle because I kind of anchor things between Ham and Lovell here. So in '69, I remember that summer I was on the plebe detail watching Apollo 11 land on the moon up in one of the company's wardrooms. And then in April of '70, the Physics Honor Society took a field trip down to the Cape. And I got to see Apollo 13 launch. And I remember walking through the VAB, seeing these Saturn V rockets stacked to go to the moon. And then watching Naval Academy grad Jim Lovell command this mission. And I never dreamed that I held astronauts in such high esteem. I didn't think that was something I could actually aspire to. I just wanted to fly jets. And that kind of set the bit that, hey, maybe I could do this. And I got these pictures of the rockets stacked up, but nobody took a picture of me. I never dreamed I'd end up back there as the director one day. I kind of wish I had that picture. And then when I was, one of my collateral duties before my first flight, I was the Deputy Chief of Aircraft Operations out at Ellington Field. And there was this young ensign that was stashed out there waiting to go to flight school, Ken Ham. And I said, hey, would you like to go flying? So I took Ken on his first flight in a T-38.
That really is what you alluded to between Lovell and Ken.
Yeah.
And think of the history that is sitting here in front of you, and they made this stuff happen. It gives me chills. Anyway.
But to say that, you know, and it was mentioned earlier, you know, it's the whole team. You know, astronauts are just such a small part of it. We're kind of the visible part, but NASA, our country is amazing. What we can accomplish when we set our mind to a goal. We're the most... We're the most innovative, ingenious people going. And all you got to do is point this team in the right direction and give them the resources to get the job done. And we just have an amazing team at NASA. Phenomenal folks.
Ken, your two shuttle flights, how significant were those? Why? What did they mean to you?
Looking down this table, they were insignificant. If you'll allow me to digress a little bit, I'll expand a little bit more on that story about flying with Bob. I graduated here in 1987 and out of the aerospace department here, and we had a new professor on board that came from the Goddard Space Flight Center, Dr. George Piper. And he happened to know, or maybe be good friends with another man, George Abbey. And after graduation, this is the time frame right around when the movie Top Gun came out. So everybody and their brother and their sister wanted to go down to flight school. So it was hard to get into flight school. There was some time to kill. Between the two of those individuals, they arranged for a period of time to go down to the Johnson Space Center for Idiot Ensign to get some experience in naval aviation at NASA. What I learned there were the people were unbelievably talented, which was just amazing. I had never seen a concentration of humanity with that much smarts. But the other thing I learned was they were a lot of fun. We went and flew in a T-38. It's the first time I've ever been in a real jet, first time ever going supersonic. We're hooting and hollering. I'm thinking to myself, this is awesome. This is living. It's great stuff. And before I answer your question,
go.
I'm going to steal another 60 seconds if I may.
No,
this is a concept.
I've
I've
just
just been
want.
sitting here listening to great stories, looking around the audience here. I don't know, what do we have, about 6 or 7 billion people on this planet now? Somewhere in that ballpark. Only 3 of those are the most recent people to return from space. One of them is in the crowd over there. My good friend, Commander Chris Cassidy. Class of '93, here for your 20th reunion. Congratulations to that. From all of us, Chris, welcome back to planet Earth. It's good to see you home. significance of those two missions was the question. And I think it's kind of relevant to frame that particular time frame of shuttle missions. And they're bookended by the return to flight after Columbia and the end of the space shuttle program. And that those two occurrences resulted in a situation where we had a finite period of time with a finite mission. The mission was finish the construction of Space Station, complete all of our obligations to our international partners, build this amazing engineering feat that is up over our heads right now, and do it by 2010. We went over by a little bit, and we used a little bit more money than they initially gave us, but it was a finite mission. It almost kind of felt like a time frame with a military-type mission. Go get this stuff done. And we had the support of senior management, which was running cover for everybody, and we were all really busy trying to get 22 flights done in almost exactly 6 years, from July 2005 to July 2011. 21 of those flights went to Space Station, one went to Hubble. And in that time frame, we played on all of the experience we got from learning how to do rendezvous in space, how to do spacewalks in space, how to do robotics, how to operate the space shuttle from its initial days of being an amazing machine to being an amazing and very complicated machine. And getting all that done in those missions, we accomplished some amazing things. As a country and as an international group building Space Station, it's really remarkable what was done in 6 years' time there.
You know, and to add on to that, when Ken talks about the end of the shuttle program, Atlantis flew its last flight in July 2011. That flight was probably the best flight in 135 that the shuttle ever flew from a processing point of view. It was the cleanest vehicle we've ever seen come back, and the team was totally dedicated right up to the very end. It landed on a Thursday, and that Friday, 2,000 people were laid off at the end of the shuttle program.
Bob, you just talked, again, so articulately about what we're capable as Americans of accomplishing once we decide we're going to accomplish it. So where are we right now?
Well,
what is it we want and or need to accomplish from this day forward? Where are we going?
Well, we need to remain a world leader in space. We have to. It defines us as a nation. If we want to be a world leader, we got to lead in space. And if we give up our leadership in space, we'll be a second-rate nation. I really believe that. We are moving forward at NASA. Well, first off, NASA's budget in real dollars is the lowest it's been since NASA was incepted. I mean, we're less than 0.5% of our tax dollars. But yet nothing's been taken off our plate. We still have everything that we're being asked to do, and that's an extreme challenge. And, a program manager has three things he can deal with: cost, schedule, and technical. And you don't want to sacrifice your technical. You want it to work. And when the cost, when money's taken away from you, the only thing you can slip is schedule. So things tend to slip out longer. And in the end, they actually cost more. But right now, NASA is moving forward. NASA's three top priorities are the Space Launch System with the Orion Multi-Purpose Crew Vehicle, the International Space Station supported by commercial space to get us there, and the James Webb Space Telescope, which is going to allow us to look back further in time than we ever had. But from that point of view, at KSC, we're preparing the facilities down there to support the Space Launch System, this heavy lift rocket that utilizes 4 shuttle main engines, LOX hydrogen, and 2 solid rocket motors that are 5-segment boosters instead of 4 like the shuttle. The very first Orion spacecraft is
What is that? What is Orion spacecraft?
It's a multi-purpose crew vehicle. It's being assembled right now. There's flight hardware at the ONC High Bay that processed the Apollo capsules, now processing. It's actually a manufacturing facility that Lockheed Martin has runs. It was built in partnership, refurbished in partnership with the state of Florida. They invested $35 million in it. But there's a vehicle being built for the first test flight that is going to fly less than a year from now, next September, on a Delta IV Heavy, taking it out to 3,600 nautical miles and then re-entering it about 80% lunar reentry velocity to check out the thermal protection system on it and some of the other systems. And then the first flight of the vehicle with the Heavy rocket is scheduled for 2017 right now if we stay on schedule from Pad B at the Cape. So we're we've modified the pad. We're in the process of completing those modifications. We're modifying High Bay 3 to the vehicle assembly building to support it. And we're modifying a mobile launcher to support it, in addition to changes, upgrades in the Launch Control Center in Firing Room 1.
Since Constellation was canceled, what were the effects of the cancellation of Constellation?
Well, and that came at the end of the shuttle program, too. This all kind of hit NASA all at once, and it was demoralizing because we had this mission, and then we didn't have it anymore. And it took the team a while to, to work through that. But I can tell you right now, down at the Cape, we got about half the total workforce we had at the end of shuttle. We've gone from 15,000 down to 8,000. And the civil service workforce is about the same, 2,000. But the team is motivated to make this happen, to enable commercial space operations at the Cape and support the heavy lift rocket that's going to allow us to go beyond planet Earth again.
How many of those people have moved over to private industry from the Cape? Any?
Well,
a significant number?
There are some that have moved on to other areas that had to relocate to get work. A lot of the technical workforce that was working down at the Cape on launch operations now work out at Wallops, supporting operations there with Orbital and their subcontractors. But, there's still some folks actually did retire. There's still folks that are out of work that are looking to come back in as we build back up and more commercial operations take place at the Cape.
How have the relationships changed between NASA and private industry in this period of time, this transition period that's going on? What's happening?
And I'm sure the commercial guys will talk more about this, but what we're doing with Space Act agreements, first off, every spacecraft we have ever flown has been built by a commercial company. It's just how you contract for it and make it work. And the SpaceX that we're using today with the 3 commercial companies right now that are under funded Space Act agreements, SpaceX, Sierra Nevada, and Boeing, it's just another form of a government procurement. And Tom talked about defining your requirements. We want to make sure that we define our requirements well and that they truly are requirements, and then let the contractor work to meet milestones in order to deliver their spacecraft. Kripp and I were talking earlier, throughout all these commercial companies that are building spacecraft, we have friends that, are working for all of them, former astronauts and flight controllers, engineers that were working for NASA before, and they're not going to build something to let their friends fly on that they don't think is safe. So I'm convinced that they will be successful, and we'll end up with a contractor, a vehicle that we can contract for to fly our crews to the space station.
Kripp, going back to, your experience, first a military pilot, but also, then your whole space experience, when you've watched this lately all unfold, what have been your reactions?
Truthfully, when we had Constellation canceled and then Congress worked to get part of it back, namely the SLS and Orion, I was pretty chagrined that we had taken away the moon objective. We do need a vehicle to get us out of low Earth orbit. And the SLS and Orion will do that for us. So in that part, I'm very positive. Question is, what mission do we do? Right now on the table, NASA is working a asteroid retrieval thing that has some positive benefits of it, but probably the most, from my perspective, is that it gives us a specific thing to go work toward. It's hard to build a vehicle or a set of hardware and software that you don't have a specific thing that you can do with it. But in truth, it's kind of like the shuttle. The shuttle was a capability to get in low Earth orbit. It didn't have a specific mission, although we knew we were going to use it to build the International Space Station. It gave us some flexibility to pick out what we wanted to do, and the SLS and Orion will do that as well.
Jim, as you go back to your period and see what's evolving now, what are your impressions about where we're going and the extent to which we're going to make ourselves as a nation first in space again?
Well, I haven't been close to the recent progress of the commercial people or even the latter part of the shuttle. I saw the last shuttle land, but it appears to me that whatever we do in space, the idea of the United States having a lead in space technology, I think is important to this country to have that, because some of the intangibles there, for instance, ever since 1957, has been an impulse to the young people. It's been the young people are really have an affinity for what they see the space program develop. And I think it's been mentioned here by all the people that before they became astronauts, so they were looking at other people who were astronauts and what they wanted to do. And when, you know, when I gave that Forrestal lecture way back in '73, and all of a sudden, you know, people are saying, "Gee, I'd like to do that," and that's what happens. That's what's going. But we don't have that now. It appears to me that we're like a ship without a rudder. I mean, we're wallowing in the sea. We have ideas of what to do, and hopefully that all congeals together to have a good, solid program that we can concentrate on. In other words, put our assets into one program, have it really designed to do something. Now, I have to look at some of our robotic work. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Curiosity and what the robotic people are doing. That was a marvelous technical and engineering feat to get that robot on Mars. And you know, if we could have that same will and the same direction to put something of manned space flight into Earth orbit to acquire what we have there, I think it's very important for the country.
Ken, Ham, what are you telling your students these days about the possibility of their futures in space, given all the tentative nature of what we seem to be hearing about our future programs?
I get asked that question all the time, and I'm sure Ken Reitler does as well. In the classroom, we are surrounded by midshipmen that are fascinated by this subject, want to know about the future of humankind, let alone Americans in space. And unfortunately, I agree with Captain Lovell that things are a little confused in our vision for the future. They're not necessarily all that substantiated. However, I do have faith that we're going to get through this time frame that we're in right now and come out with something focused. Because if we don't, nothing's going to happen. And I believe that we as a country are going to eventually find a path that leads to a substantiated future. This subject you're asking about here is near and dear to all of our hearts and probably every American. What most people may not realize is part of the privilege of being an astronaut is an obligation to share that experience with the public for the rest of our lives. It's kind of what we're doing here today. I would say through thousands of informal interviews with random Americans that you meet in different events, my feeling is that what Americans crave is a substantial mission in human exploration. So what does exploration really mean? It's kind of the root of the question. And I think we need to learn from the successes of Apollo and maybe Apollo's biggest failure, which is that it was never a mission with a future. The job was to go out there and tag the moon, which was a spectacular event, but we never had the funding and the idea in place of what we were going to do after that. And now here we are, over 40 years since human beings have been on the moon. So I think it's really critically important that we don't set ourselves up for another situation like that. Maybe we work really, really hard to go tag Mars, but if we don't have something to do there to satisfy the human need to explore, I think we may be setting ourselves up for failure. I think the root of all this comes down to what human beings have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. When we explore, we go explore, and then we live there. So it comes down to, call it creating a colony. I know that's a space-type word, but it's really inhabiting what you went and explored. I can't tell you how many folks I've run into that said, well, why aren't we living on the moon? And that's the question. Why aren't we living on the moon? And if you look at you compare the idea of living on Mars or living on the moon, when I look up in the sky, the moon's that big. When I look up in the sky at Mars, it's that big. That means it's really, really far away, which means it's really hard to get there. It takes a long time, and it's going to be difficult to figure out how to live there. It seems completely obvious to me that we need to figure out how to live and survive as a race on the moon. And if we do that, I think you'll find the American public will be completely behind that mission.
You mentioned funding and obviously decision-making about where are we going to go. Bob, who makes those decisions? How are those decisions to be made in today's culture of Washington mess?
You put them on the hook here, you know?
The president recommends a budget, and our Congress...
You want to take the fifth, you're welcome to.
And our Congress delivers one to us, hopefully,
Say again,
someday.
I'm sorry. What? Go again, say again.
No, it's national will, it's policy, it's political. You know, NASA makes recommendations, and, you know, the president has to say, this is what I want you to go do based on the recommendations NASA's provided. And then the Congress modifies and supports what the president submits. But it's been this way since the beginning of time in our country, and it's a political process. And, you know, we'll figure it out. The key is, you know, once we're directed to go do something, the team does an outstanding job of executing. To back up just a little bit, you said, what will it do to make, you know, what can we do to make America first again in space? And I think that's wrong. I think we are first in space. We still lead. The other nations look to us for our leadership in space. So I don't think we're not first. I think we still are leading in space exploration and what we do. And I should also point out, you know, this last class of astronauts that got selected, the 8 that were selected came from a group of 6,800 that applied. That was the largest number of applicants since the first group of Shuttle astronauts that applied for those positions. So, you know, there is still a lot of interest out there. One thing we didn't touch on, and it's unfortunate that the four white males are sitting at this table, but the one thing that the Shuttle brought to the space program was diversity. And I think that was a real accomplishment of the Shuttle. Jim talked about having to be no taller than 6 feet tall. You know, the space shuttle went from the 5th percentile to the 95th percentile. It accommodated everyone. In fact, one of the problems we had during Shuttle Mir in the space station was not all of our astronauts were able to go because they didn't fit. And we had to size to the Soyuz spacecraft, which eventually was modified to the Soyuz TMA, which still doesn't fit everybody that fit in the shuttle. But when you look at that first class of astronauts, you know, it was men, women, black, white, Hispanic, you name it. And it wasn't what we originally saw from that point of view. So I think that was a pretty amazing accomplishment of the Shuttle program.
I think we can. Do we have time for a couple of questions?
Yes, sir.
We do? Questions from the floor. Microphones. People. Yes, sir. Let's see.
It was pretty small when I was there, and I was only there for a day, so I'll let Ken answer. We need to get Chris Cassidy down here.
Yeah, I bet Chris does have a good answer since he spent 6 months up there. I've spent a total of 1 month spread over two-week missions. I could tell you without a doubt what the best aspect of Space Station is today, and that is what Colonel George Zamka brought up 2 flights before my last flight on STS-130,
Yeah.
and that's the cupola.
Yeah.
It is, for lack of a better definition, it's a glass hemisphere that hangs underneath the space station. You can fit 3 people in there fairly comfortably and watch the world go by. It is the coolest darn thing there ever was.
Is that where Chris Hadfield
Yes.
recorded part of his song, Looking Out the Window?
Right.
Question, ma'am, back, yes, in uniform. Sir, I'm sorry.
Well, that's a good question. As a matter of fact, I did, because one of the things you learn at the Naval Academy that perhaps you don't pick up in civilian schools is really sort of a dependability on your crew members, on the people, just like on board ship. You depend on everybody else to get the job done. And you learn that, you know, as your 4 years expire here at the Academy. And that same thing occurred in all the flights, because when you take off on any of our missions, whether it's Apollo or a space lab or a shuttle, you are really working as a team with the ground and the mission control and the spacecraft. And these things are very important because you have to have a tight, controlled team with good leadership and teamwork. And then you got to have initiative because the best plans laid don't always come to fruition. And so you have to make changes. That's exactly what happened, of course, on 13. And of course, it happened, going to the moon, Apollo 8. We had to make a decision to go to the moon rather than to go around the Earth. And so these things I think are instilled on should be instilled on the students here when they leave, to have that leadership capability and have that dependability and loyalty with each other to work together.
One more, sir.
Yeah. Actually, it was Crip that brought it up, but I'd be happy to. The asteroid retrieval mission. It's, first off, finding an asteroid. You have to identify it, and then develop a spacecraft to go out using solar electric propulsion to retrieve it, all autonomous operations, and bring it back to a Lagrange point between the Earth and the Moon, where it's going to be safe for 100 years, and then utilize the SLS and Orion vehicle on its first flight with humans, which is scheduled for 2021, instead of just going circumlunar and coming back on a test flight, to actually go fly to this asteroid that's now at a Lagrange point and explore it. Find out what it is, utilize the spacecraft, the skills of humans, and develop. It's a test flight for the systems as well. So I think it's a very challenging mission. When you look at it start to finish, develops a lot of skills that we need for working beyond Earth. From a systems point of view, working with the ground, the abort profiles are really unique in how you get to a Lagrange point, get back from it. You do have something go wrong. So there's a lot that's going to be accomplished on this mission, in addition to being a checkout test flight of the vehicle itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Lovell, Bob Crippen, Bob Cabana, and Ken Ham.